Madonna, and I beg to move that this House has considered UK defence rotary strategy. It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon, and it's a great pleasure to return to a favourite topic of mine, and I know that many honourable members have joined me on this topic before, which is future flying capability for the UK Armed Forces. And may at the outset please refer the House to my declaration of members' interests in the usual way. I pressed the Secretary of State for Defence in a debate about the RAF centenary in November 2018 to start thinking about helicopters, and I warmly welcome the new Minister to his place. I know that his experience and his enthusiasm for the topic matter will be a great asset to the department, and I wonder if I may suggest that this might be one of the first things in his in-tray, if I may. If I may, I'll give some brief background to the matter. I'm conscious there are a number of other members who wish to speak. But the UK helicopter fleet is unusually diverse. The days in which our three flying services, the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm and the Army Air Corps, could boast a glittering kaleidoscope of different aircraft types, large, small, generalised, specialised, are long gone and realistically won't be returning. But whilst capability in other spheres, Fastjet most obviously, has seen a contraction of platform types and a concentration upon one or two multi-mission types, the rotary fleet, and indeed the transport fleet more generally, has tended to buck this trend. Now, there are good capability reasons which we'll probably touch on this, which are mainly concerning capability and lift. But I will briefly, if I may, lay out the position as it is today, because it does bear thinking about in laying out the background. Mr. Madonna's 322 rotary wing aircraft in the UK Armed Forces across those three services. The Army Air Corps operates the Apache attack helicopter. That's a battlefield close air support aircraft, which will probably fall largely into a different category from those that we'll be spending our time debating today. It's a highly specialised strike platform that doesn't really have the capability for any significant lift, and certainly not for carrying troops. The Army also operates the Wildcat, one variant of the Wildcat, primarily for reconnaissance and command with a limited transport capability. The Royal Navy operates a naval variant of the Wildcat, as well as two variants of the Merlin, the Commando Merlin as it's called, which is the ex-Royal Air Force Merlin, and the naval variant, as well as some ex-Danish examples that are used for training only. The Royal Air Force operates the Chinook, the heavy lift delivery truck of the skies, and the Puma. And there's a number of other types which are used for training or transport to a lesser or greater degree. The Gazelle, the Bell 212, the Leonardo AW109, and the Juno and Jupiter training aircraft that are used by the Defence Helicopter Flying School at RAF Shawbury. So this means a relatively large number of platform types, which will present an increasing headache as they all move toward their retirement date, subject to upgrades, and will need replacing. Now, I applaud the approach that the MOD has taken to procurement recently, to many aspects of procurement policy. And I've spoken in this House before, particularly when calling for the combat air strategy in conjunction with colleagues on both sides of the House back in 2017. And I've spoken of the dreadful historic spectacle of outstanding British defence products historically that have either been cancelled or have not reached their full potential because of a lack of historic political will or of long-term procurement thinking. In 2017, we welcomed the National Shipbuilding Strategy, which set out an aspiration, for a holistic plan to build the Royal Navy's Type 31E frigates, support ships, and the industry backing to make them happen. Later that year, as I've said, in 2017, we led a call for a combat air strategy to start considering the aircraft that will in due course replace the Typhoon. The point being that with all of these systems, it is necessary, because of the development period, to start developing replacements sometimes decades in advance. And as I say, I asked the Secretary of State, the then Secretary of State, in November 2018, to start thinking about helicopters, and I return to that theme today because I would suggest that a similar approach would bear fruit when we start to consider what the UK's rotary capability will be in the future and where it will come from. Now, a quick canter across the types. The Chinook, as I've mentioned, is essentially a giant delivery truck, which has got a lift capability of 10 to 11 tonnes. That is expected to be continued in service until approximately the 2040s under the Chinook Heavy Lift Sustainment Programme. Similarly, the Apache, as upgraded and replaced, with the final delivery of the second type that has been bought, expected only in 2024, and that's intended to go out of service in 2040. So those two types are probably the least urgent platform types to be considered. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to thank my honourable friend for giving way and congratulate him on securing this debate. Always very knowledgeable and very interesting remarks he makes. He alluded to the Chinook being the delivery truck, I think you said, of our armed forces. Can I just draw his attention to the role it played in operational theatres, in picking up casualties and operating pretty much a mobile operating theatre to make sure we got casualties back to Camp Bastion as quickly as possible so they had the best possible chance of surviving, which were quite often, as you know, terrible injuries. And also join me in congratulating Boeing and the RAF for operating that aircraft for 40 years, and as you say, it's going to continue in service until probably 2060s.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for making that point. He's absolutely right. The Chinook is an extraordinarily capable aircraft. I refer to it as a delivery truck of the sky simply in reference to the extraordinary lift capability it has. But he's quite right that that lift capability means that it is able also to take a great deal of medical facilities. And many people owe their lives to that aircraft. And of course, I pay tribute to everybody who's flown it and kept it flying over the course of many years and will do. But he's quite right to draw attention to that aircraft's capability. Those two aircraft, the Apache and the Chinook, are probably, for the reasons my honourable friend's just given, the longevity of service date that is to be expected. There may be a need for upgrades, of course, to avionics, cockpits, perhaps all those engines as time progresses. But it would be a good thing to consider as part of the strategy that I'm calling for, whether any of those roles could be absorbed into other fleets as we look at upgrading or replacing capability. But the case I would suggest is more pressing with the medium lift types. The difficulty with Chinook, as my honourable friend of course will realise, is its sheer size. And whilst it's able to operate happily from aircraft carrier decks, it is far more challenged in urban environments, as is the Merlin, which, although in theory a medium lift and smaller airframe, actually covers much of the same footprint size. So the Puma is one that's critically important. That fleet is of approximately 23. It's based at RAF Benson in the Henley constituency, which borders my own Witney constituency. And that is due, I understand, to go out of service in about 2025. Although, of course, I understand that there may be some service updates that may keep it in service for a longer period of time for that. But in any event, it seems to me that we are looking at an out-of-service date for that aircraft of between 2025 and 2030, about 5 to 10 years away. And that will have an impact upon all of the other types of helicopters that are in service. In theory, the Merlin, as I've said, which is now operated by the Royal Navy, supplements that capability as another medium lift type. But it's primarily something that's operated, designed to operate at sea level as a naval helicopter, meaning that it is not ideal for some of the environments we've asked it to operate in the past, such as the hot and high environment of Afghanistan. Its lift capability is closer to 4 tonnes, meaning that whilst very capable, it's an aircraft that approaches the size and the weight of the Chinook, but without anything like as much as its lift capability. And crucially, as I know the Minister will probably refer to in due course, some of those airframes are earmarked, approximately 10, I think, for use in the crow's nest role, which will limit their capability for other purposes. So in any event, the impending retirement in 5 to 10 years' time of Puma, I would suggest, leaves a potential shortfall among that medium lift capability. And this is particularly the case because any incoming platform doesn't come up to full operating capability immediately and will have to be operated alongside the type it's replacing for a period of time. The obvious example of this in the fast jet world is the way that Tornado and Typhoon operated alongside each other until the Typhoon was able to take over under the Centurion programme all of the capabilities, or most of the capabilities, of Tornado. So the teething problems that have to be worked out, we see a similar sort of thing with Hercules and A400M, for example, may mean that there's a period of running in parallel. which would bring the decision point further closer to us at this point of time, and bringing forward the date at which replacement would need to be considered. Now, moving on to the need, the type of aircraft that we might need, or aircraft system or systems, very much is dependent upon what we envisage the need to be. I'd like to make a general foreign policy point, which I think many honourable members will agree with, which is that I would suggest that foreign policy goals ought to be decided first, with the military capability developed to match those goals and then funded appropriately, rather than what has often seemed to be the case in the past, where defence capability is trimmed piecemeal in order to fit the available budget, leaving our forces ever more stretched as they try to fulfil a full spectrum capability from peacekeeping to expeditionary warfare, but with fewer platforms to do the work. And I know the Minister will tell me that there's a review ongoing, and critical it is too. But equally seriously, and perhaps this is really a matter for another debate, that budgetary pressure on procurement, on procurement of kit means that the men and women operating it do so under deteriorating service conditions, as more and more of the defence budget is required to deal with platform renewal, leading to an increasing concern, as we've all spoken of many times, with retention of those men and women who fight and run our armed services. Now, if I can take the two aircraft carriers as an example of a microcosm of how this works together, and referring to the debate on a carrier strategy that we had in this place relatively recently, the nation has to decide, I would suggest, how and in what circumstances it is to use this new capability. The obvious deployment is for power projection, carrier strike, using the F-35s that we are buying. Now, if that's the case, then those carriers are likely to be kept as far offshore as possible in order to keep them safe from land-based threats. If so, would there be a need for organic carrier-based air-to-air refuelling capability to maximise range or to sustain combat air patrols? What about the resupply of weapons or engine changes? Now, our American allies, of course, have a different approach. They have the speed and lift of something like the V-22 Osprey to resupply their smaller carriers, but I fully anticipate that the complexity and cost of a machine like that may be something that it isn't realistic for us to consider. And on board our carriers, the absence of cats and traps means that a fixed-wing capability delivery truck like the Grumman Greyhound is equally something that it's not possible for us to have. So there is the lift capability of the Chinook, of course, as I've said, but that does severely limit range. That would also be available for any littoral role, which, of course, presents another set of challenges, particularly with regards to land-based threats. But in any event, what is clear is that a huge amount of protection will be required for those carriers and for those carrier battle groups. The Merlin Force and Crow's Nest I have referred to, whilst, of course, other platforms will be required for anti-submarine capacity, which is of now highly defensive, as opposed to in the past where it has been primarily offensive when they're looking at submarine capability. Now, one new factor that will have to go into the strategy, this is why I called for a strategy rather than just talking about helicopters per se, is how much of that current rotary output could be conducted by unmanned aircraft, because, of course, the advent of unmanned and of AI brings a whole new picture to this dimension. The role of a naval surveillance aircraft, just look at the naval picture for a minute, is to loiter, to search, to spend time looking for submarines or hostile small craft. Some of that could be done by UAVs based upon warships, either alongside or replacing, to a certain extent, supplementing piloted helicopters. That would have benefits in terms of cost, survivability, freeing up manned assets where they are truly needed, like troop transport. UAVs, in short, could be used for the dull, dirty, dangerous tasks like standoff surveillance, search and reconnaissance, and long-term anti-submarine operations, but would be a real game-changer in terms of size required on a warship with payload and persistence. Of course, once we've considered that in the maritime domain, it's easy to see that many of those same benefits could also be applied across the land domain as we look at some of the smaller helicopters that are used by the Army Air Corps. What is vital is that this technology is only emerging, and it's vital we put a strategy in place to ensure that we are leading in that digital world, in the artificial intelligence world, particularly so that we do not have to end up having to rely on technology developed by others who may not have our best interests at heart. I'd like to say a few words before I finish just about sovereign capability and other nations. With regards to sovereign capability, there's been a trend across defence recently for foreign military sales purchase for various reasons, and I don't want to critique the rights and wrongs of any of those decisions now. But whereas an off-the-shelf purchase can provide a proven, established, matured capability and a speed of procurement, what it loses is British sovereign capability with all the impacts that that has in terms of defence security, investment, tax revenues, and, of course, jobs. As with combat air, I would suggest it's likely that anything that we do in the future is likely to be in concert with other nations. Britain being likely to add value in the high-tech sphere rather than in the airframes. As with combat air, it will take time to explore these options, but I would suggest that we would need to consider what it is that we would want to contribute to any such future programme, what that industrial base would be, to make sure that we don't either miss out on making the most of everything that British industry could add to that, or has so often and frustratingly been the case in the past through failing to think about the issue in advance, failing to plan, failing to have a strategy, and then having to buy off the shelf because there's an urgent procurement requirement for an operational reason. So we ought to consider who those partners might be and whether we could expand on bilateral relationships and what that might mean for foreign policy if we were to do so. For example, the French force, the French largest helicopter is the Super Puma, our medium lift aircraft, such that our Royal Air Force has been assisting the French in Mali, and they are considering a heavy lift acquisition of their own. One option might be to consider some sort of NATO helicopter force along the lines of the Heavy Airlift Wing, which provides three C-17s to 12 participating nations, including the United States, either to provide a heavy lift joint helicopter capability or to address the medium lift capability that France is likely to have at about the same time as the United Kingdom. There would be other bilateral arrangements that could build on the Lancaster House principles, and there's all sorts of issues that would need to be worked out. We would need to consider what would happen in a war fighting rather than a peacekeeping role. We would need to consider what happened if only one country were operating and wished to use part of that fleet. And so I don't do anything more at this stage other than to ask that those things are considered because it takes time to work them through. And I am conscious that I'm asking not so much for a rotary strategy, but for a defence stroke foreign policy stroke industrial rotary strategy. It's multi-pronged and multi-part departmental. Maybe we could call it a global rotary strategy to fit with global Britain, but it will take time. Thank you very much for listening. I'm conscious that I have raised more questions than I have solutions. My aim today is really just to provoke the debate, and I have no preference for any particular outcome. But what I would like to gently press the department to do is to consider what the rotary fleet's likely to look like in around 10 years' time, to consider what it is the country wants or needs, which I accept as a foreign policy consideration as much as anything, when it will need it by, what it will cost, and the technological and industrial requirements for that, and what those would be, and then we'll have a rotary fleet fit for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just advise members that if they are making a reference to their interests, they need to be slightly more specific than just to refer to the register. I apologise that I've come in at the end to say that. The question is that this House has considered UK defence rotary strategy. Marcus Fish.
Thank you, Mrs. McDonough. It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I wish to thank my honourable friend for securing this debate. I think he made a very thoughtful outline of some of the high-level strategy issues that we need to consider. And I want to welcome the Minister to his place. It's a great honour to have a Somerset colleague performing such an important role for the country at this time. We absolutely do need to have a helicopter strategy, a rotary wing strategy. I would agree with that. It's an issue I've been championing with the department for some time now. The member for Witney did make some of the arguments very eloquently for why that is the case. In my own constituency, we have probably the biggest centre of helicopter manufacturing operations in the UK. It is the only end-to-end design and manufacturing aerospace capability left in the UK. And the design skills are really, really important to the community and I think to the country to preserve for some of the reasons that my honourable friend was mentioning. It is massively important to have the capability to make the most of the advances that are coming in autonomous vehicles, in the aerial space. And unless we preserve some of these skills and we invest in them for the future, it is very difficult to see how we can play a full part in the development of new technologies into the future. And as he said also, if we want to be global Britain and if we want to have more of an industrial footprint on the world and have more influence with our NATO allies and other allies, then I think it's massively important that we have a contribution to make in the technology sphere. And I absolutely welcome the government's focus on more spending on R&D, more spending on skills, more spending on infrastructure, and really focusing on regional areas such as Somerset for investment in order to level up and take advantage of some of the installed base that we have. So I want to thank also the department, the MOD, for its support for the helicopter industry in the UK. They do a lot of work on export promotion and helping with demonstrating the capabilities that we have at the moment, which we build in Yeovil. My honourable friend mentioned some of the platforms that are there, the Merlin, which is a heavy lift, and the Wildcat, which is more of an which is a much smaller helicopter, but a very well-regarded one around the world. And I know how much the company appreciates the MOD's help in helping to demonstrate what a great aircraft that is to some of its export opportunities around the world. The company currently estimates that there is potential for £11 billion worth of export sales. So this is a real opportunity to utilise what we do well in Yeovil to advance the nation's export interests. It's fair to say that the Wildcat is very much an integrated part of the Navy's defence systems. I think probably the Navy have sort of done a more inventive and creative job of thinking about how that platform can become an integrated part of the defence systems. I think the Army Wildcat has, I think there are opportunities to use that in a more creative way as well. It would be a brilliant addition once it gets a missile, if it can get a missile, to actually work in tandem with the Apaches, for example, to increase the capability on the front line where it's used, and I think it was worth looking at that properly. I think my honourable friend for Witney, the member for Witney, also mentioned the potential for thinking about what replaces the Puma, and it's worth mentioning that Leonardo has a civil helicopter platform in Italy, the AW189, which it would like to militarise and has suggested that it might be able to use Yeovil as the centre of its centre for military excellence for the company worldwide, should there be significant orders coming through for the AW149, which is the militarised variant of the 189. I think it is worth the MOD conducting a capability review to see whether that helicopter might be part of the solution. But I completely agree with my honourable friend that we need to look at all these things in the round, and I think doing that within a formal helicopter strategy would be an ideal way of conducting that. We've obviously had the defence industrial policy, which is very welcome, but I really do think that we need to focus on rotary wing. When it comes to autonomous vehicles, we've heard of some of the possibilities there for that to be used off our aircraft carriers. I think we welcome the unmanned aerial vehicle collaboration, which the MOD has been conducting with Leonardo to investigate some of the capabilities and potential solutions to some of the need in that area. But it is very much a long-term program, and unless we are investing in that now, then I really don't think we can expect our industries in the UK to be leaders in it. So I really welcome that. It is worth also saying, I think, that we should be doing more to look at the way that we procure, because, as my honourable friend for Whitney said, sometimes when procurement's done in a reactive way, there's a need to only look at headline price, and it doesn't necessarily take into account the full gross value added, which can occur throughout an economy when you're looking at long-term program development. The example in Leonardo is that there are nearly 3,000 employees within the site in Yeovil itself, but when you look at the whole supply chain, you've got about 10,000 people in the supply chain, and about 2.4 times every pound of headline direct value added is actually added within the consequential impacts on the rest of the economy. So I think this is a really important industry. It's a really important capability for our forces, and we need to have that sovereign capability, and we also need to get better at innovation itself. So I think it's worth looking at how we certify. I think some of the processes around certification take so long that in the modern world, where you have in other parts of industry, not just the defence industry, a shortening of product development cycles, we need to make sure that the certification burdens and the bureaucracy around that don't interfere with swift development of our military capabilities as well. And we need to, and that's got a real impact on the ability to commercialise products really depends on that as well. Quite often, a defence industry, what do you call it? Skunk works, I think, is the technical term, which is a term for a little company trying to do something unusual. Quite often, they won't know whether a product is potentially going to be regarded as a dual-use product until 5 or 6 years into their development cycle, by which time they will have had to maybe spend up to £10 million getting a working prototype up and running, etc. And that's a huge risk to be taking before you even know what your marketability is going to be. So I think there are ways that we can look at changing the procurement process to make that a more innovative and easy to commercialise system. And I just want to also say that I think, talking about foreign military sales, I'm very struck by the idea. We should probably be thinking about whether the UK should have its own foreign military sales program. We kind of hear a lot about what the US does in that regard, and it is quite attractive. I actually think it would be an interesting innovation to be thinking about whether the UK should be offering similar types of deal to friendly allies, whether it's France or other types of allies. I think it shouldn't be only the US that has this ability to deal government to government, and it might be worth thinking about how such a scheme should work. So I absolutely agree. We must make the most of what our opportunities are. I do absolutely support the call for a formal helicopter strategy to complement the combat air strategy, and I think that that would help enormously with our long-term decision-making processes and our justifications. And on that basis, I absolutely welcome this debate and thank my honourable friend for bringing it about. Thank you.
Can I call Carol Monaghan?
Thank you, Ms MacDonald. It's a pleasure to speak in this afternoon's debate, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Whitney for raising the issues he has today, in particular around the way in which we plan or don't properly plan our defence strategy. And it's interesting to see many of the same faces as we saw pre-election back again for one of our defence debates. Now, I do have a particular interest in this issue, having been rescued by a Sea King helicopter on the hills of Argyll on the Cobbler when I was a teenager. I was hill walking with two of my friends, and unfortunately one of my friends dislocated her knee. The third friend had to run and alert Mountain Rescue, and I was airlifted off the Cobbler by a Royal Navy Sea King helicopter. Now, my poor friend spent the journey in the back of the helicopter. I was taken into the cockpit and got a wonderful ride down Loch Lomond to Alexandria, where the hospital was. So that was actually what started off as not a terribly great experience ended up for me a particularly memorable one. The Sea King, of course, was retired in 2018. And it is right that we're here discussing how we're going to replace different types of aircraft that are important to our armed forces. In July 2016, the MOD signed a 10-year partnering agreement with Leonardo Helicopters, which envisages the MOD spending approximately $3 billion with the company over the next decade on the upgrade and support of the helicopter fleets. Now, although the arrangement commits both sides to working together to achieve improvements in cost effectiveness and innovation, the agreement's not a legally binding contract with a definite financial value attached, but an indication of support. And we've hit this issue before when we've had defence debates, because defence procurement requires long-term assurance. And the UK government should be committing to long-term funding to ensure that there's a steady drumbeat of orders, not just for rotary wing, but also for different areas of our defence landscape. Now, the Honourable Member for Whitney mentioned how we should be bringing in new technology whilst old technology is still in use, and the importance of working in parallel. But that hasn't always worked in the past. And we know with the Nimrod, there was a gap where capability certainly was reduced whilst we're waiting for the P8s to come online. And whilst, of course, they are now starting to come online, but we've had several years where we have had a vulnerability there, particularly in the North Atlantic. So that should not be happening. We should be seeing where the threats are and where the potential issues are before they strike us. Our defence policy must also remain in step with our European allies and our closest neighbours, even after we leave the European Union. The Combat Air Strategy talks about the UK's unique network of capability collaborations, and will work quickly and openly with allies to build on or establish new partnerships to deliver future requirements. And there's a strong overlap between the defence interests of the UK and the EU. And the UK government's policy must take this into account, despite the fact we will be leaving the European Union in just a few days' time. The Honourable Member for Yeovil raised an issue that's very close to my heart, and that's one of skills and skills gaps. This is something that I do believe we're starting to see some progress in. We do see companies taking active positions in order to attract different people, more diverse workforce into different areas, but it's not enough, and more has to be done. I've spoken many times about the lack of female representation across STEM, but particularly in engineering, and we still do not see enough female role models. We still don't see companies doing enough to actually go out and attract them. And the importance of that, of course, is if we're missing out on 50% of the population, we're missing out on 50% of the skills. He also talked about the importance of R&D and spin-out products that could come as a result of that. As a scientist, I'm never going to complain about more money being spent on R&D, so I was pleased to hear him mentioning that. Of course, the strength of our armed forces depends as much on the strength of our personnel as it does on the equipment. We must make sure that any steps we take into account the needs and requirements of the men and women who serve in the armed forces. And we've mentioned before in this place the need for some sort of representative body that can consult current and former personnel to ensure that the issues that are pertinent to them are at the forefront of defence planning. The Honourable Member for Whitney talked about strategy, and really is the nub of this afternoon's debate. What is it we actually need? He talked about UAVs, he talked about cyber. And I think we have to be careful here that we don't think that what is required in 2020 is what's going to be required in 2025 or 2030. We must always be planning our defence capability to the future, looking to the future. And it would be naive to think that we still need the same sort of defence in 50 or 100 years' time as we do today. So it is important that any defence planning or procurement is taken with an eye to the future. Finally, he spoke about the possibility of a NATO helicopter force, and I thought that was a really interesting idea, because it is not the case that we always need to have everything here in the UK. Where can we provide specialisms? Where are our areas of pure expertise? What can we contribute to a NATO task force? And as we look at defence procurement in the future, as budgets are becoming increasingly tight, can we look at where capability is needed and how we can contribute to that force without trying to do everything? Because trying to do everything, you spread yourself thin, and inevitably some things are not done as well as others. So where is our expertise, where is our excellence, and what do we need in terms of rotary capability? Finally, I would thank once again the Honourable Member for Whitney. He has a real knack of managing to procure Westminster Hall debate, so maybe I'll have a word with him after this to find out what his success is. Hopefully he can get similar success with his rotary strategy.
Stephen Morgan.
It is a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Ms MacDonald. I thank the Honourable Member for Whitney for securing this important debate. I've observed first-hand his commitment to our armed forces through the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme, and I thank him for initiating the debate today on this very important issue, especially as we both have had the fortunate opportunity to travel in a Merlin, I think, a Chinook and Wildcat, seeing what our armed forces do first-hand. I'd also like to thank the Honourable Member for Yeovil, who has made an important point around the value of industry and the need for skills going forward to meet the challenges that our nation faces. And I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Glasgow North West, the SNP spokeswoman, because I certainly value the contribution she's made around the collaboration with the EU as Britain leaves the EU. From troop and equipment transportation to search and observation work and submarine protection, the 332 rotary wing aircrafts in the UK Armed Forces play a crucial role in defending national security. And I've always been clear that government has no higher duty than the protection of our citizens and the maintenance of national security. Alongside this responsibility, government must strive for operational advantage. Key to that is maintaining sovereign capability. A national strategy for naval shipbuilding and combat aircraft has paved the way for an ambitious vision for the future in these sectors. And now, as the Honourable Member for Whitney has said, it is time to talk about helicopters. This must be part of a wider defence industrial strategy. If the government fails to provide a clear strategy for the prevention of our sovereign capability to design and manufacture helicopters, this could jeopardise investment, jobs and the security of our nation. We've heard today the case for a comprehensive, joined-up and integrated wider approach, because it will allow a conversation to take place around defining a clear way ahead to preserve our national advantage, to ensure that our highly skilled workforce continue to deliver innovation and are at the heart of discussion, and bring to the forefront arguments for building British, securing us as world leaders. And for this reason, I would like to reiterate calls on the government to urgently look at a wider defence industrial strategy, with rotary wing aircraft playing a key role. This must be part of a strategic defence and security review and encompass expenditure, policy and operations across the full spectrum of defence, security and foreign affairs. So I therefore put to the Minister today, who's responding, when does he expect the formal process to get underway for the strategic defence and security review? And in that review, when can he confirm that rotary wing aircrafts will receive consideration tantamount to the contributions they bring to the UK Armed Forces? We know that future air warfare will increasingly be complex, with significant technological advancements over the lifetime of a single rotary wing aircraft. As threats evolve, we must evolve with them. And without a comprehensive strategic defence and security review, this will be deeply challenging. Mr McDonough, I vow to continue applying scrutiny and pressure to government on this issue and will continue to work alongside all members here today to see that rotary wing aircrafts are given the priority they deserve. Thank you.
I'll call the Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr McDonald. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship on this, my maiden voyage as a minister. So I'm sort of ever so slightly nervous of inadvertently spending loads of money and getting told off when I get back to the department. But it gives me great pleasure to respond to this debate, and I congratulate my friend, my honourable friend, the member for Witney, on securing it. Last Thursday, he and I had the opportunity to visit RAF Bryce Norton in his constituency, and he is a very eloquent and passionate supporter both of the Royal Air Force, but also the importance of the Royal Air Force to the community that surrounds that base. And it's fantastic to see today that his interest extends not beyond the parochial and into a wider interest in defence matters. I should also add, of course, that in my previous career, I've had some first-hand experience of the fantastic work of those who serve in our joint helicopter force. They have flown me in Northern Ireland, Iraq and Afghanistan on occasion with things sort of travelling very fast to try and hit us, and the courage that our pilots show in flying helicopters in combat zones, and the amazing ingenuity of engineers who keep them flying, often in quite challenging environments, is not to be underestimated. And so at the top of this first opportunity to speak as a minister, place on record my admiration for those who fly and support our helicopters on operations. Ms McDonough, Defence already supports 115,000 jobs across the UK. That's 1 in every 220, through over 18 billion of annual spending with industry. Now, I think there's an opportunity for that to translate very positively into the government's levelling up agenda. And so one of the things that we will seek to do this year as we go through the Integrated Defence Security Foreign Policy Review is also to understand the opportunity to participate in that levelling up agenda and see how we can spend that defence budget to have the effect in the regions of the UK where there is opportunity to invest in defence. Now, I'm pleased to say that I have personal experience of that and have seen it with the rotary sector in Somerset. This year, we will see the opening of the iAero Centre in Yeovil, which my honourable friend, the member for Yeovil, campaigned vigorously for. That facility will drive innovation in local aerospace and promote its ongoing competitiveness in UK and the world. This has been made possible by Defence's long-term investment in Leonardo helicopters and the financial commitment by Somerset County Council and the Local Enterprise Partnership. The centre will deliver a real opportunity for our region, but also for industry and academia to collaborate on innovation, and will be an accelerator for our region's goals to look at how clean tech can be employed in manufacturing and focus on future developments in autonomy, AI, hybrid and electric power, as well as other sustainable technology and advanced manufacturing and engineering. There, our investment in Rotary will act as a catalyst towards wider innovation, which I think is hugely exciting. And having seen how that opportunity might work in Somerset, I know that, and having also visited very recently other defence companies who are investing in skills and innovation in the communities within which they operate, I'm clear that there's a real opportunity to exploit that further, and it's a very exciting proposition that I'm looking to make a really important part of my work in this brief over the years ahead. The SNP spokesman made the excellent point about people within the defence industry, and she is right to note, too often the case that when you walk into a boardroom in a defence company, it's very male indeed. And that quite a large part of the senior workforce in those places is very male indeed. I've noticed an interesting discrepancy between the graduate entry into defence companies, which is still very male, but interestingly, at the apprentice level, people coming directly in at 16, much more balanced. And I think that's a very interesting thing for us to explore. Why is it that both male and female students look at an apprenticeship in the defence industry with equal enthusiasm, but when we come to recruiting people out of universities to go into engineering roles within defence, we succeed less? I'll gladly give way.
Thank the Minister for giving way. Of course, what I've been told by some of these companies is that they will actively go and recruit a certain number of girls and a certain number of boys. So they're actively doing that, which doesn't seem to be happening to the same extent at graduate level. Maybe they simply aren't there at graduate level, but I would agree, definitely at apprenticeship level, we are seeing some improvements.
I thank her very much for her interest in this, and I think that the best way to accelerate that pursuit of equality in the way that defence companies recruit is for those of us in ministerial office, shadow roles, and indeed just a wider interest in defence to put pressure on them to do so. There's clearly a workforce challenge when it comes to high-end engineering, and the fact that we're not good enough collectively at attracting half the population into defence roles is clearly not good enough, and an area for significant improvement within the industry. Now, moving on to equipment, over the next decade we are spending over £180 billion on equipment and support. This includes £9.6 billion specifically on rotary wing. However, our financial commitment to rotary wing is much greater, nearly £24 billion over the next decade, including infrastructure, personnel and training, all of which will positively impact on local economies. Our armed forces are obviously the biggest customer of the UK helicopter industry, and to summarise some of the investment the government has made to date, this includes more than £1 billion to develop and manufacture 62 Wildcat helicopters, £900 million on delivering 30 Merlin Mark II into service, about £300 million upgrading the Merlin Mark IV across 25 aircraft fleet, and £271 million on Wildcat support. And to my honourable friend from Yeovil's point about arming the land variant of Wildcat, the maritime version will already have a missile, and I'm certain the Chief of the General Staff will have noted his suggestion that the land variant might have one too. And we've put £269 million on Crow's Nest. Finally, this year, the first of the new Apache AH-64E models will arrive in the UK and provide a step-changing capability for our land forces. Through this continued investment, our rotary capability is growing. These developments have been made possible by a relationship with the rotary wing industry. Airbus continue to support the Puma fleet and provide our training helicopters, which are modified in Oxford. In Yeovil, Leonardo helicopters continue to be the only UK-based company with an end-to-end design, build and support capability. They are seen as world-leading in advanced rotor systems, transmissions and blade technology, Our long-term commitment to Leonardo through the 10-year strategic partnering arrangement has allowed them to have the confidence to invest in their skilled Somerset workforce, technology and supply base. They have 2,795 highly skilled jobs and many more in the supply chain, 104 apprentices and 33 graduates, with a further 65 joining this year. 340 million invested in UK R&D over the last 5 years, and around 400 million per year with over 800 UK suppliers, including 105 small and medium-sized enterprises. We have also brought highly capable rotary platforms from Boeing, and through our partnering initiative have secured Boeing investment in advanced manufacturing in Sheffield. Boeing, in turn, have committed to increase UK jobs and supply chain opportunities, including UK companies providing 5% by value of the entire Apache's AH-64E fleet. A key part of government's rotary strategy and defence industrial policy is a collaborative approach to exports. Exports will continue to be fundamental to delivering affordable equipment to our armed forces and greater value to the UK. With the support of the UK government, industry won export orders worth 14 billion in 2018. Rotary is an important part of that export success. We supported the export of 12.3 billion of sales of Merlin, Wildcat and Lynx, and have enabled around 8 billion of associated support business. This has allowed Leonardo to invest in their skills and generate new products in the UK. Most recently, this included the export of the AW101 Merlin helicopters to Norway and Poland, and sale of the AW159 Wildcat helicopters to the Republic of Korea. Moving, Ms McDonough, to the rotary strategy, which is the crux of the debate. As we all know, we now operate in a more uncertain, more complex and more dynamic environment. As we develop our future operating concept for our modernised force and what this means for our rotary wing strategy, we need to be mindful of certain technological improvement. And indeed, this afternoon I had the opportunity to sit down with a former director of DARPA and the Ministry of Defence's current chief scientific advisor, to have exactly that discussion about how, with an exponential technological curve, we make the right decisions about future capability to avoid fielding already near obsolete capability. And so this is a timely discussion about what that looks like specifically in the rotary space. We believe that manned rotary capability will continue to be a vital requirement in all environments, but it will increasingly be teamed with small unmanned systems and may, in some areas, be replaced entirely by large autonomous systems by the 2040s. We're innovating with industry to test these unmanned air systems and ensure our UK armed forces can access what they need. These unmanned systems range from small vertical takeoff and landing systems to very large-scale, 2 or 3 ton, unmanned air systems that our Royal Navy sees as critical to the future maritime environment. Right now, the Navy's DARE team are partnering with innovative UK companies to develop small rotary or VTOL UAS technology. This includes a £250,000 investment with Malloy Aeronautics to develop a tethered rotary drone. The MOD has already invested with Leonardo helicopters on rotary wing unmanned concepts, and we continue to discuss how we might develop a UK large rotary unmanned air system that could support rotary assets in the future. As I've already explained, the environment we operate in will continue to change. This is an ideal opportunity to review our approach to rotary wing capability ahead of big decisions on future capability. This debate has also highlighted that it is not just about the equipment. The 2009 rotary wing strategy recognised the need to change how we operate our rotary wing capability. Since then, we have rationalised our core fleet to only 5 platforms, providing efficiencies in how we operate, man and support these platforms to be an effective fighting force. Our aim is to ensure that we can mobilise, modernise and transform the way we deliver and operate rotary capability across defence. This is not just about platforms, personnel training, infrastructure and in-service support, all of which will be vital to how we deliver our aims. We must ensure the enterprise is as efficient as it can be so we can deliver more military capability to the front line. Our thinking is also informed by our international partners, some of which have been discussed in the debate today. And we are, of course, leading efforts within NATO to look at next-generation rotorcraft concepts and opportunities. This will help to drive consensus on what the future requirements will be and ensure that industry is ready to meet them. We're also observing the US Army's Future Vertical Lift program. This is an ambitious program to develop a family of new generation helicopters. There is much we can learn from the US's approach and conclusions, but we have made no decisions on our future rotary requirements, nor how we would deliver them. Our review of rotary wing strategy will need to inform and be informed by the government's overall defence and security objectives. This is why I'm pleased this government is committed to the deepest review of Britain's security, defence and foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And I note the shadow ministers hope that a timeline might be confirmed soon. I'm sure that news will be forthcoming. The MOD will enthusiastically participate in this review and will ensure we have the right strategy in place to meet the challenges and opportunities we face as a country in the decades ahead. The industrial backdrop and some of the themes that have been mentioned, skills, export, new technologies, are applicable across our industrial base. Our refreshed defence industrial policy, published in December 2017, sets out our commitment to encouraging a thriving and globally competitive UK defence sector. We have decided in the past to adopt alternative approaches in specific areas, shipbuilding and combat air, and we continually assess our approach to other sectors to determine whether we need to develop separate strategies or whether they can form part of a wider defence industrial strategy. This government recognises, Ms McDonough, the importance of defence rotary wing capability today and in the future. We will continue to ensure our long-term strategy is coherent and encompasses the equipment, support, training, basing infrastructure and the industry we need to deliver it. Moreover, we see this as an opportunity for the defence pound to meaningfully contribute to the government's levelling up agenda, and is encouraging to note the number of local enterprise partnerships that have included defence and aerospace in their regional industrial strategies. The rotary sector has a great story to tell, and it is fortunate to have champions in Parliament as eloquent and knowledgeable as my honourable friends for Witney and Yeovil, and to have the considered and largely, I think, sort of consensual contributions from the opposition parties as too. One of the things I'm particularly looking forward to about working in defence, though I'm sure we will have our moments, is that actually this is an area of policy where very often everybody wants the best for the soldiers, sailors, airmen, marines who ultimately have to go to dangerous places on behalf of our country. And I'm really looking forward to working with spokespeople and shadow ministers on the other benches to make sure that as we go through this year where we're going through this security, defence, foreign policy review, there's an opportunity to share our ideas with you and you with us so that we can come to some conclusions that are sound and will endure. But that leads me to my final point. There is pressure, understandably, from my honourable friend, the member for Witney, who has sought a debate, principally to raise an ambition for a rotary wing strategy. My gut feeling is that in a year when we are looking more broadly at our defence, security, foreign policy needs, when we're seeking to understand the threats that are emerging and how we will counter those across all 5 domains, land, sea, air, cyber and space, that we first need to understand all of that, work out from that what our strategic ambition is, exactly what the SESR process is there to do, to work out what the role is for the defence pound and the levelling up agenda and how that contributes to a defence industrial strategy. And then to look beyond that at whether there is a requirement for bespoke sector deals or whether actually the wider programme covers what we need. So I hope he will be patient. I hope he will participate just as all other colleagues will. I think this is going to be a really fascinating time to be involved in defence policy, and I look forward to hearing the thoughts of colleagues further as the year goes on.
Yeah. Robert Courts to wind up.
Thank you, Ms McDonough. And I have 1 or 2 just comments. Thank you for your guidance on register of interest. I was referring to airshow tickets, which I have declared, and hospitality received from the all-party parliamentary group of the armed forces. Thank you for your guidance. Can I thank as well all other colleagues for the very constructive and collegiate approach that they've taken to this debate. My honourable friend for Yeovil, of course, has enormous constituency interest in this matter. He's absolutely right when he speaks of R&D and skills and the potential for export sales, which I hadn't referred to, but of course he's absolutely right about that. The SNP spokesman, I'm very grateful for her, the story. I'm not surprised helicopters matter, given the story that she has told. She's absolutely bang on about the skills gap and about the importance of STEM and inspiring our young people, and particularly the lack of female engineers, which is something that we're all very aware of and absolutely must address. I'm very grateful also for the opposition front bench, as always, constructive collegiate comments, because so much of what we're trying to do in this sphere is cross-party. He's absolutely right about the wider defence industrial strategy, which I hadn't quite put that context in. I'm grateful to him for doing so. And also just to the Minister for his highly constructive comments today, and an outstanding flying start, if I may, if that's not too much of an awful pun for the debate in this to close this off. I'm grateful to him for mentioning the Jupiter and Juno helicopters, which of course are serviced just outside my constituency at Oxford Airport, but many of my constituents work on them, and so that's something that's of enormous importance to him. I applaud the government's investment that he has referred to, and that's absolutely right. It's the strategy surrounding all of that I push for. I know he understands that. I entirely accept his point that there is a wider defence and foreign policy review going on at present, and that this may have to await that. It's simply something I'd like to put across his radar, and on the wider importance of Rotary strategy within the foreign and defence review. We are in cordial agreement. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered UK defence Rotary strategy. As many of that our opinions say,